Hello everyone, this is Steven coming to you again with another Legacy Deck Tech video, and today I'm going to be featuring probably my favorite and what I consider to be one of the most unique decks that you can play in Legacy. This is called Lands, and it is known as Lands because we play with 34 lands, and our primary win condition is winning with lands, as you would guess. I'm going to start out showing some of the spells that the deck plays, and later in the deck tech I will show you the lands because the lands are so unique and require a little bit more discussion than basically just saying these lands tap for mana. So to get started with, I will show you the acceleration that the deck uses to basically play a much more fast game than our opponents. And how we start that off with is a card called Mox Diamond, and it is an artifact. How this works is you cast it, and when it resolves, you can discard a land from your hand. And we use this as a source of artifact ramp. And when you discard a land, this can tap for 1 mana of any color. Now, the deck that I'm going to be featuring today is called Red Green Combo Lands. So we won't be using this for casting 5 different colors of spells, but what it is important is it allows us to play 2 mana cost spells on turn one, or even 3 mana cost spells on turn one, and it gives us this sort of ramp advantage against our opponents. It's also in a form of artifact, and so it allows us to have all of our colors through things like Blood Moon. The deck doesn't really have a main deck way to win through Blood Moon, but we are still able to cast all of our spells through a Blood Moon. And so this is one of the most important cards that we can have in our opening hand. Later on, I will talk about some of the opening hands that you would want to keep with this, but very rarely do I ever want to mulligan a hand that has a Mox Diamond and a number of lands in it. The next source of ramp we have is called Exploration, and this is pretty basic. It says you may play an additional land each of your turns. So one of the fundamental rules of Magic is you can only play 1 land on each of your turns. With Exploration in play, you can play a second land, and these do stack. So if you have 2 explorations in play, you can play 3 lands. If you have 3 explorations, you can play 4 lands. This is again one of our primary sources of not card advantage, but mana advantage. So when we're looking for our opening hand, we like to see a Mox Diamond or an Exploration in our opening hand. Our final source of advantage is in an enchantment called Mana Bond. And this is a card that is very unique to this deck. It says during your discard phase, you may choose to put all land cards from your hand into play. If you do, discard the rest of your hand. So basically, what this allows us to do is to just dump all of our lands into play during our discard phase. Most decks would say this is ridiculous. You'll never be able to cast your spells. Later on, I will cite why this is not relevant to us, but this card is one of the few ways that allows us to get a turn 2 win with the deck, and I will show how that happens. But this is not a card that I am looking to see in my opening hand, but I would typically say most of the busted I win on turn 2 games tend to formulate around having a Mana Bond in my opening hand. Next, we will go to what is probably the most important spell to see. It's very hard to win the long games without this card. It is Life from the Loam, and what this does is it allows you to return up to 3 lands from your graveyard to your hand, and it has this important keyword here called Dredge 3. And how this works is if it's in your graveyard, anytime you may draw a card, say for instance your opening draw phase, if it's in your graveyard, you will return it to your hand and you will dredge 3, and you will just take 3 cards from your library and you will put them into your graveyard. Now that this is in your hand, you can tap your mana and you can cast it and return lands that are being dredged into your graveyard back to your hand. And using the enchantments that I showed you, Mana Bond and Exploration, all those excess lands that go into our graveyard from putting them into our graveyard from being dredged will allow us to return them to our hand with Life from the Loam and then cast them with our enchantments. A lot of people think Ancestral Recall is one of the most busted cards of all time. It is 1 mana, draw 3 cards. This is our Ancestral Recall because we want to be drawing lands. This allows us to draw 3 lands a turn, but we do it from our graveyard as opposed to doing it from our library. The next spell I will be talking about is Gamble. Gamble is a card that says you may search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, then discard a card at random, and shuffle your library. Gamble is 95% of the time used to find Life from the Loam. And the reason why we don't care about the fact that we discard a card at random is because, again, of the dredge mechanic. So you go and you tutor for a Life from the Loam from your graveyard with Gamble. If Life from the Loam happens to be the card that's discarded, well, what do you know? During any time we get to draw a card, we will dredge it. Gamble is known as Gamble because sometimes you gamble for a card that you are hoping will stay in your hand. Very rarely do I ever gamble for a card that I'm hoping to play immediately. Gamble is always upside. If I gamble for a land with Life from the Loam in the graveyard, I'll be able to return it to my hand. If I gamble for a Life from the Loam, I actually actively want it to be discarded. So Gamble is basically just tutor for any card I want to. There are rare occasions where I will gamble for something like a Mana Bond or an Exploration, but typically I will be gambling for Life from the Loam. The only times I do not gamble for Life from the Loam is if I already have a Life from the Loam engine going. The next spell I will be talking about is Crop Rotation, and this is a spell that allows us to sacrifice a land and search our library for a land card. This is a combo enabler, and it allows us to get some surprise wins. I will be talking about some of those surprise wins later on. But basically, this is just a tutor for any land. There's a lot of situational land cards that we play in our deck, and I will be going over many of them shortly. But this is our tutor at instant speed for any land, and the drawback is we have to put a land into our graveyard. But again, we run Life from the Loam, so we will be able to get those lands back. So we do have to interact with our opponent. We can't just sit behind our wall of lands and enchantments. Creatures do want to be attacking into us, and the way that we fight that is with this card called Punishing Fire. And Punishing Fire is an instant that deals 2 damage to target creature or player. It has this ability here: whenever an opponent gains life, you may pay red. If you do, return Punishing Fire from your graveyard to your hand. There's a land called Grove of the Burnwillows, and when it taps for green or red, your opponent also gains a life. So you use that red mana that you tap from Grove of the Burnwillows, gains them a life, and you use that red mana to return Punishing Fire to your hand. So this is one of our engines that we have in the deck. So again, this is a way to basically win the game if we do not aren't able to establish one of our win with a land combos. As long as we have a Grove of the Burnwillows, we can constantly deal 1 damage to our opponent per turn because it deals 2 damage and then they gain a life. So if you can cast Punishing Fire 20 times against your opponent, then that's one way to win the game. Now that we are done with the spells, I will discuss some of the lands we play. We'll start off with some of the boring ones. These are our fetch lands. The deck plays 4 fetch lands. All the fetch lands are green fetch lands. Right now I'm using Misty Rainforests. It could be any green fetches. You can run Wooded Foothills. You can run, they don't all have to be 4 of the same. Some people like to play 4 different names of fetch lands, so that way they can't be surgically extracted. There's very little benefit to running 4 individual fetch lands. The only thing that is a requirement is that they have to be fetch lands that can fetch for a forest, because all of our lands that they could get in the deck are green. We do run 1 basic forest, and yeah, we run a basic forest because Wasteland is a card, and while we are able to survive being wastelanded multiple times against our opponents, it is nice to be able to fetch for that wasteland and to not be able to get tempoed out against some decks. It is not an easy matchup, but I would say Rug Delver tends to be an interesting matchup because they do Wasteland and Stifle, so being able to get that opening forest against them is very important because it allows us to safely cast our spells without worrying about having our mana taken out of the game. Finally, we run 2 Taiga. All of the spells in our deck are green and red, so we only need to have Taiga as our dual land. It is one of the cheaper dual lands, so while the deck isn't one of the easier decks to get into, we do have the benefit of playing one of the cheapest dual lands in play. So yeah, it's a Taiga. It taps for a forest or a mountain mana. Next up, we have the Grove of the Burnwillows, and this is the land I was talking about as its combo with Punishing Fire. So as you can see, add red or green to your mana pool, and each opponent gains 1 life. So if we go back to Punishing Fire and look at it again, we can see the combo of whenever an opponent gains a life, you may pay red. So that red that you generate that gains them a life, you use that to return Punishing Fire to your hand. So just showing you how the combo works. Next up in our mana suite, this is Tranquil Thicket. Very rarely do I just play Tranquil Thicket just playing it tapped. This is a cycle land. So the thing with Dredge is whenever you draw a card, you may replace it with Dredge. So you can use this as instant speed Dredge. One of the ways to beat this deck is to for a Deathrite Shaman to say eat our Life from the Loam, or somebody to play a card like Surgical Extraction on our Life from the Loams. And how we are able to beat that is in response to them targeting our Life from the Loam, we can cycle our Tranquil Thicket and return Life from the Loam to our hands, so now it is no longer being targeted anymore. In addition to just, being able to save our Life from the Loams, it allows us to get some extra dredges. So if we're actively trying to find our combo, we can start returning Tranquil Thickets back with Life from the Loam to get multiple cycles. So sometimes you can dredge 9, maybe even 12 cards on some of your more busted turns. Next up, we are now going into the disruptive package of the lands. We run 4 Wastelands and 4 Rishadan ports. They both do similar things. So what Rishadan ports are is for 1 colorless mana, you can tap Rishadan port to tap target land. And how we use Rishadan port is to prevent our opponents from casting spells. If you tap somebody's land during their upkeep, the mana that they would generate from that is lost when they go into their main phase. So if your opponent has 1 land in play, you can tap that land, and now they no longer have mana that they can use. They can no longer spend that mana on their turns. So if we think our opponent is trying to cast, say, a Jace the Mind Sculptor, if we have a couple of Rishadan ports in play, we can now tap their lands, basically making it nearly impossible for our opponents to ever cast spells that cost 2, 3, or 4 mana. And the other land that we use Rishadan ports in with is Wasteland, and Wasteland is we use it as a spell. It's just destroy target non-basic land. And one of the cute things that we can do with this, it's not one of the more fun ways to win the game, unless you're a sort of a bit of a masochist, but If you play against decks that run no basic lands, you might have now noticed the interaction that Life from the Loam, returning back wastelands over and over again, you can get to a point where you've now wastelanded every single land that they have in their library. So if you play against a deck like, say, Rug Delver, they run 3 volcanic islands and 3 tropical islands. If you can wasteland them 6 times, they've now locked out of the game from ever casting spells. So that's one of the ways that you can just win the game. Just prevent your opponent from casting spells by wasteland, enrich, and import. Sometimes creatures are a little bit too big for punishing fire. You run into creatures like Tarmogoyfs. They're 4/5s, or you run into just any creature whose toughness is greater than 2 or greater than the number of punishing fire engines you can achieve. And this land is tap and target attacking creature becomes untapped. This creature neither deals nor receives combat damage. This is one of the lands that I very likely want to crop rotation for if I see that I'm being aggressively attacked by a Rug Delver opponent that has multiple Tarmogoyfs in play. If they tap out, I will crop rotation one of my lands that are no longer useful anymore to try to get a couple of Maze of Ith in play. Typically, if I'm not actively searching for my combo, this is a land that I like to see multiples of. The one downside to this land is it doesn't tap for mana. Very rarely now, in fact, never. One of the policies of Wizards now is they don't generate lands, or they don't create lands anymore that don't tap for mana. This is one of those old-fashioned lands who just is sort of this global enchantment that just sort of stays on the battlefield. It's a very hard to interact with sort of spell, just allows prevents your opponents from attacking into you. And I run 3 Maze of Iths. Currently I run 3. There have been times where I have run 4, but right now the meta calls for 3 Maze of Iths. The next tech land that I play, and this is one that is, I would say, one of the more gotcha lands. It's called Glacial Chasm, and it has this effect called Cumulative Upkeep of Pay 2 life. And when Glacial Chasm comes into play, you sacrifice a land. You cannot attack. All damage dealt to you is reduced to 0. As long as this is in play, you cannot lose to damage. So if somebody's just attacking you with 15 creatures, you can crop rotation for this, put it into play, and now you take 0 damage. So if I'm, say, playing against a combo elves and they get their natural order for Craterhoof Behemoth and they swing in for 50 damage because they have 10 creatures in play, and the Craterhoof generates this big, so now I'm getting attacked for basically an insane amount, some damage that's greater than my life total. Well, I crop rotation for Glacial Chasm, I take nothing. Yeah. And I can now sacrifice this every turn to its not paying its upkeep, return it back from Life from the Loam. So if I'm playing against any deck that does not have Wasteland, this is basically, I've now locked them out from ever being able to win the game because they can no longer just beat me with combat damage. This is the sort of Black Lotus of the deck. It's one of the, I would say, it's hard to explain Tabernacle of Pendrell. A lot of people that play lands say, well, you don't really need Tabernacle because it's it's kind of an expensive card. You don't really need it, but until you've played with Tabernacle of Pendrell, it's hard to not notice the effect that it has on games. And again, it's one of these lands. It doesn't tap for mana. It says all creatures now require an upkeep cost of 1 colorless in addition to other upkeep costs they may have. If the upkeep cost for a creature is not paid, that creature is destroyed. So going back to the Wasteland engine, if we have creatures in play and we wasteland all of their lands, any creatures that are in play, or they now have to destroy them. So Tabernacle is particularly strong against decks that play a bunch of creatures against you. This is one of the sort of the locks that you can put down against an Elves deck, because now they can no longer just play a bunch of creatures into you, because they now have to pay for all of those elves that they put in play. And if you're able to wasteland enough of their lands, they may have played 7 or 8 creatures, and you drop a tabernacle into play, and then you wasteland their Gaia's Cradle. Now they have 1 forest in play and then 7 creatures. So on their upkeep, they have to basically destroy 6 of their creatures. It's a very punishing card. Like I said, it's one of those cards where until you've actually played against it with a deck where it's relevant against, it's so hard to describe the ability that it has. But there are some decks that literally just cannot beat a Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale in play. So now that we've gone through some of our interesting tech lands, we will go into the primary win condition of the deck. It plays with one of the... it's a Cold Snap land, Dark Depths. It's a legendary land, and this is important noting on it. When it comes into play, it comes into play with 10 ice counters. And for 3 colorless mana, you can remove an ice counter from Dark Depths. And when Dark Depths has no ice counters on it, you sacrifice it. And when you do, you get to put this 2020 Merit Lage token into play. And I would say most of the games we win are winning by assembling the Dark Depths and this other land, Thespian Stage combo. Thespian Stage has this ability: 2 colorless mana, tap. Thespian Stage becomes a copy of target land and gains this ability. So just to show you how this works, when Dark Depths comes into play, it comes into play with 10 ice counters. Thespian Stage copies Dark Depths, but it copies it without getting the ice counters, because Thespian Stage copies it. It doesn't come into play. And so Thespian Stage becomes Dark Depths. You sacrifice the Dark Depths that is in play, and then this Thespian Stage is the one with 0 ice counters on it. You go to the ability of when there are 0 ice counters on Dark Depths, you sacrifice it, and you make a Merit Lage. There are a number of ways that you can assemble this. You can basically play an Exploration and just play these 2 into play. So yeah, just to go over this again, because this is an important distinction of how this works. If you have Thespian Stage in play with no ice counters on it, you copy the Dark Depths. Again, because you're copying it, it doesn't come into play with those ice counters. You sacrifice the one with the ice counters. This Thespian Stage is Dark Depths with 0. And you make your Merit Lage. Swing for 2020. It is flying. It is indestructible. It is indestructible, so if we have a Thespian Stage in play, we do not have to destroy it. We can target it, but our Thespian Stage does not destroy our own Dark Depths. So that is the deck. I will now go to the sideboard of the deck. One thing I would like to say about the sideboard is, because we are primarily good at beating up fair creature-based decks, most of our sideboard is dedicated to one of 2 different kinds of decks. One deck that we have very, very little ways to beat in our main deck, or any combo decks, so Storm decks. So we have a lot of sideboard slots dedicated just to the Storm matchups. We play with 2 Chalice of the Voids, and we have a lot of ways that we can generate 2 mana on turn 1. Some decks also, a Chalice of the Void for 0 is good, so if you play against a Storm deck, you can Chalice for 0, you counter their all of their Lotus Petals, you counter their Lion's Eye Diamonds. If you Chalice for 1 against any blue decks, you can counter all their Brainstorms, you can counter all their Ponders, you can, against combo decks, you counter their Dark Rituals. There's very few decks that play no 1 mana cost spells. We do play some, but for the most part, we are willing to sacrifice not being able to play our 1 mana cost spells to get a Chalice of the Void in for 1. The next sideboard slot is we play 4 Sphere of Resistance. This is a 2 mana artifact that says all spells cost an additional 1 to play. We bring this only in against Storm decks. Basically, this is a way to make it so all of their spells cost an additional 1. So if they're going to try to combo you off by playing 10 spells into a Tendrils of Agony, they now have to spend an additional 10 mana to get there. In addition to our Wastelands and our Chalice of the Voids actually countering their spells, it makes it very hard for them to ever get to a Storm count against us. So these are our anti-Storm cards. The other matchup that is very brutal for the lands matchup is Miracles. And the reason why is because our Life from the Loam costs 2 mana, and we have to cast Life from the Loam a number of times in order to get the lands from our graveyard into our hand and then into the battlefield. So if we ever play against a counterbalance that has a 2 mana spell sitting on top of their library, as long as they have a Sensei's Divining Top to leave it there, they can kind of lock us out from ever being able to win, as long as they can Swords to Plowshares our initial Dark Depths. So how we try to combat that is we play with 4 Krosan Grip, and this is destroy target artifact or enchantment. Now, the reason why we play this over, say, a Naturalize is because it has this ability Split Second. And what this means is when this is on the stack, you cannot interact with it. Now, this doesn't mean that it can't be countered. It just means that you cannot put any spells onto the stack. So when this is on the stack, it's the last thing that goes there. However, Counterbalance is a triggered ability that does still trigger. So you can still Krosan Grip a Counterbalance, and if they happen to luck flip into, say, a Vendilion Click or an Entreat the Angels, they can counter the Krosan Grip. But if they don't know it's coming, they can't just Sensei's Divining Top and leave a 3 up there forever. So Krosan Grip is one of the ways that we try to combat them. We also bring in Krosan Grip against white decks. I will almost always bring in 4 Krosan Grips against any white-based decks because they play Rest in Peace. And Rest in Peace, we cannot win through Rest in Peace without just naturally assembling the Dark Depths Thespian Stage combo. Some other spells and cards that I bring in, I will bring in Choke against blue decks, mostly Miracles. And Choke says islands don't untap during their controller's untap steps. So if you bring this in against Miracles, they can't just be sitting there tapping their islands forever looking at their Sensei's Divining Top. This is very powerful with a Rishadan Port because you can Wasteland their fetch land, and if they search for a duel or an island, you can tap it with Rishadan Port. So they can't just sit there and hold up their lands forever. As long as you have Wasteland and Rishadan Port into play, you can force them to now tap their lands against their will and not be able to get their benefit from it. I have a few more lands that I play in the sideboard. The other one that I play, this is a new addition to the deck. It's Boseiju, Who Shelters All. I play this entirely against Miracles, and it's pay 2 life, add 1 colorless to your mana pool. Mana spent on an instant or sorcery spell can't be countered, so I can pay 2 life to make it so that my Life from the Loam can't be countered. And again, I only bring this in against Miracles. I play 2 tech lands in addition to the Boseiju. I play Bojuka Bog. I bring this in against any Reanimator or Dredge decks. I can crop rotation for Bojuka Bog in response to any reanimation effect or to any Dredge effects. And this will go into the play, and it will exile their graveyard. So yeah. The other land that I play this now in the sideboard. It used to be a main deck inclusion, and that is Karakas. Reanimator decks aren't, and Show and Tell decks aren't as popular as they used to be. When they were, I would always play Karakas in the main. Now I'm seeing Show and Tell and Reanimator decks not be as popular anymore. Again, I bring this in against decks that have a lot of legendary creatures so that I can return them to their hand. And then the final addition to the deck is Molten Vortex, and this is Punishing Fire number 5, and this allows me to discard a land card and pay a red, and Molten Vortex deals 2 damage to target creature or player. So yeah, as long as you have Life from the Loam in play, you can return you return 3 lands to your hand, and you can use red mana to now deal 2 damage to creatures. I bring this in against Miracles. I also bring it in against decks that have, white weenie decks like Death and Taxes. The most important deck that I bring this in against is any Deathrite Shaman based decks. Deathrite Shaman is a card that is very hard to win against because you can't life from alone because the Deathrite Shaman will eat it. So we want to bring this in against Deathrite Shaman decks primarily. So that is the deck. Thank you for watching this video. I will, in the future, show a different version of the lands deck called the 5-color domain or the Rug lands deck. And this deck is less focused on the combo. It doesn't play 4 Thespian Stage Dark Depths, and it's more of a prison control deck. And I will show you that later on in a future deck tech video. Thanks for watching.